Well, you may find this hard to believe because I ate a lot, but I never used to be this big. I used to be your size. Can you believe that? No? Yeah, Milo can believe me. The rest of you look very skeptical. I used to be your size. But when I was your size, I used to go to church too. And I went to a Christian church. We're not a specifically Christian church. But I went to a Christian church. And to be honest, I remember very little of it. But I do remember this one story. And it's always stuck with me. And it's called the story of the Good Samaritan. Have you ever heard it? No. It's the only story I really remember, and I got taught it in Sunday school by the minister, and it always stuck with me. And it's a story that Jesus told, and he told it in this way. But one of the things that a great Unitarian religious educator, Sophia Lyons-Faz, asked was, think about the different people in the story and how you would act in their position. Okay? Think about the different people, because there's 4 different characters in it. And it starts off with this relatively wealthy traveller who was Jewish, and he was going to the market. And he had a long road to travel. But his wife was a little bit worried. He said, that road, is you going to the market in Jericho? And she said, yes, that's a dangerous road. Do you think you'll be okay? And he went, oh, I'll be fine. No, don't you worry. So he was heading out the gates of his town, and there was a sentry in the gate. He said, where are you going? He said, oh, I'm going to the road to Jericho, to the market to sell my goods. And he said, oh, that's a dangerous road. There's been a lot of robberies on the way. Are you sure you're okay? And he said, yes, I'll be fine. He said, well, you could wait and go with other travelers, and you'll be safer. And he said, no, I'm going to wait. I'm going to go. I'm not going to wait. I'm going to go by myself. So off he went. What do you say? Sounds funny. I think that's probably funnier than my story. But anyway, so the man sets off, and he's got his donkey, and he's got all his goods. And guess what happens to him? He's turning around this corner. There's these trees, and these 3 robbers jump out. And these robbers are really mean. They steal all his stuff. They steal his donkey, and they take all his clothes, and he's left there. When they beat him up, he's not everything, not all his clothes. They took his clothes, but not his underwear. Good question. Good question. But he's lying there in his underwear, which that's kind of embarrassing.
Who's only in his underwear?
What's that?
Who's only in his underwear?
He's got really big underwear. So he's lying there, but he's been beaten up because the robbers were mean and they really hurt him. And so he said, what am I going to do? I'm lying there in the sun. I'm getting thirsty. I can't move. And then all of a sudden he hears a clip-clop of a donkey coming along. And it was a priest, a religious leader like myself on it. And the priest sees him. And the guy said, oh, this man will help me. He's a good person. But the person crosses over to the other side of the road and goes past him. So the person's looking, oh, I'm running late. I've got a service to do. I can't stop to help him. Maybe someone who's got more time can stop to help him. Now it's going to be too involved with me. So the priest goes on. Then so the man's really disappointed, but he's lying there, getting thirstier, and he's getting sorer and sorer. And then he hears another person coming along. And this person is what back in that time's called a Levite. And they're people who help run the service. Kind of like Blythe is helping me here, but Blythe would stop. Blythe's not that kind of. Blythe would stop and help someone. So he comes along, and the Levite looks at him and said, well, he's been beaten up. It must be very dangerous here. I'm not going to stop because I'm scared for myself. So he crosses the road. And then this other person comes along, and he's called a Samaritan, and the Samaritans were a group of people in this land back in this time they were not very well liked. They were kind of, discriminated against. And he's coming along, and he's scared as well. He's scared because, there's robbers, he could get beaten up. But he looks at the person and says, what would I want to do if I was in his position? I'd want someone to stop and help me. So he stops and he cleans up the wounds. He gives the person something to drink. He lifts the person up. He takes off his shawl and puts it over him, lifts him up into the donkey and takes him away. And so they end up, he takes him into the inn and he asks the innkeeper, can you look after him for a couple of days? I'll pay for everything, but I want to make sure he's okay, but I need to go and take care of myself. So he takes away. And so one of the things that Jesus says is that's an example of how we should act when one another. And that's Samaritan, he was discriminated against, and he thought, that person might not do the same for me, but I want to do the right thing for them. And he said, and I think that's always a good thing when we come across a situation. Do you see someone at your school who may be struggling, who's lonely, maybe they're struggling with their homework, maybe they've got no friends? We can always reach out to them and help them because they probably need it, because if you were in their position, you might want to be helped. And so I always remember that story. When I see the opportunity to help someone, I should try and do it. And I have to say, I don't always manage it, but when I truly think of that story, it reminds me that I should step out and help people when I can.
A year and a half ago, my husband Hanju and I were walking down a street in Boston when a man yelled at me, "Hey, if you put the box of soda in the garbage can, it'll be easier to carry." Okay, let me explain. We were helping Hanju's niece move into her new apartment. We had made a trip to Target and purchased some items for her. Upon our return, we parked about a block away. One of the items I was carrying was a kitchen garbage can, in which we had put some smaller, lighter items. I decided I would carry the garbage can on one side and rectangular box of soda cans in my other, since that one was too heavy and too bulky to put in the garbage can. I noticed some people hanging out on their front porch area in front of their apartment building as we passed. One of the men saw us, and that's when he yelled his advice at me. Now, I was born and raised in urban and suburban parts of the Bay Area. One thing I have observed in my many years here is that neighbors don't usually shout advice about how to carry stuff to one another. If they do, they probably know each other really, really well. I'd never met this guy before in my life. I was so taken aback by his comment. I was rattled. And why? Why was this reaction so weird to me? He had honestly been trying to help me. It was clear that his intent was positive. Why are we so silent to our neighbors here in the urban and suburban areas of the West Coast? Why do people keep to themselves so much here? What are we afraid of? Honestly, I think we may have lost something precious. I had initially felt like this stranger was being, presumptuous, intrusive, rude. But really, he was being a good neighbor. I just saw a quote 2 days ago that addresses the spirit of community. It goes, "Mutual aid is not rooted in generosity. It's rooted in community. I don't like when people see community building as selfless. Building community is necessary for both of us. It's crucial to your survival today, and it might be crucial to my survival tomorrow. But community building can be selfless sometimes. In the case of Hazel, it was very selfless. I want to talk about something I just learned about my dear mother-in-law, who just passed away on November 9th, at the age of 88. Hazel Goodwin Kim was an amazing woman, so driven, so caring, and so strong. I am sad that I only met her in person for the first time 3 years ago. I really wish I could have had longer to get to know her. A lovely woman, a fellow congregant of Hazel's at her church, got up at the funeral and spoke. She talked about how she had struggled with kidney issues and then kidney failure for a few years. At one point, she learned that she needed a kidney transplant. She turned to her family, but no one in her family was willing to help her. About a year ago, she finally opened to the pastor of the church, saying she needed a kidney. The pastor asked and was granted permission to tell a handful of congregants, and Hazel was one of them. She was told about this on a Saturday, and the very next day, Hazel approached this woman after Sunday service and said to her, "I want you to take one of my kidneys. I mean it." Hazel was 87 years old when she said that. Of course, this lady graciously told her, "No, thank you. Thank you for offering, but I won't be taking one of your kidneys." The thing is, Hazel was really willing to give a kidney to this woman. I don't know about you, but I think this is one of the most Good Samaritan stories I've ever heard in my life. How many of us, when we reach 87, will be willing to go through the hardship of losing a kidney to give that to someone else? Now, I am not asking all of you to walk out of here and donate a kidney to the nearest person you see, but my suggestion here is there are probably ways that we can gently push ourselves out of our comfy West Coast bubble of silence to show up for each other.
Well, we had an election at the beginning of November. This is the first time I've been back in the pulpit since then. And one of the reminders I gave the Sunday before was to put a spiritual identity at the center of who we are and not a political identity. Because politics is about power, it's about winning and losing. Spirituality is a whole different emotional landscape, and we have to put a spiritual identity of who we are, because we're all much more than our politics. So thinking of how we want to move into this spiritual identity, I want to do a series of services exploring those classic religious stories throughout the world. And with it being December and moving into Christmas, I wanted to start with a Christian story. And you heard in the Time for All Ages, the Good Samaritan story, a story probably familiar to all of us, if not most of us. And a story, I wasn't joking with the children, it's probably one of the few things I remember from a Christian upbringing. But one of the things that gets lost in that story is, of course, it's about helping someone who's in need, and that's always a good message. But Jesus told that story in response to a question. It's a question from a lawyer who was in discussion, and the question was, "And who is my neighbor?" And Jesus told that story in response to that question. And prior to that, that discussion, the lawyer who Jesus was in discussion with has asked him, "How can I lead a good life?" And Jesus asked the lawyer, said, "Well, what does Scripture tell you?" And he says, "Well, you shall love Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." You will love your neighbor as yourself. And that's assuming that we love ourselves. As I remind you, our first principle, the inherent worth and dignity of all people, means the inherent worth and dignity of ourselves, of each of you. So assuming we love ourselves, what does that story mean? That parable that Jesus told as to who's the question? Because the lawyer asked the question like, who is my neighbor? And how do I love them as myself? And I love what Sophia Lyon-Faz, probably one of the most influential religious educators of the 20th century, who was a Unitarian, does. She said, put yourself in the place of all the different characters in the story. I often do that on Christmas Eve with the different characters in the Christmas story of the birth of Jesus. But put yourself, why do people get involved? And why don't they get involved when they see someone in need? No, you can go down to outside of Safeway in Redwood City and you see a lot of people in real need. I live in San Francisco in the Tenderloin district. I see people outside my door in desperate need. And most of the time, honestly, I walk past them. And of course, in that story, there was the minister who was busy, the priest who was busy because they go to service. There was the Levite who was worried about he might get robbed. And of course, I imagine the Samaritan went through the same thing. But then you imagine what it was like to be that person, to that person lying with his underwear on. Not naked, had his underwear on. As the children asked about. But that idea, like putting that idea of empathy allowed him to take action. Because we often think of love as an emotion. But love is only meaningful if you take action and become loving and demonstrate love through compassion, through care, through kindness, and yes, through justice. But the story of the Good Samaritan is quite important because the Good Samaritan takes care of the person, takes him to an inn, but then also takes care of themselves. They pay someone to help the person while they go off. It's not completely about giving, it's also about taking care of yourself as well as taking care of others. And I think that's an important part that gets lost in the story of the Good Samaritan. And of course, the Samaritan was someone who was oppressed, excluded, disliked in the culture they lived in. So it was interesting that the way we refer to that is the Good Samaritan. We add that adjective to it. It's not just the Samaritan, it's the Good Samaritan. So there's even a judgment in that story which troubles me. But why don't people get involved and help when we need to? There was a famous experiment, I've heard of it, called the Darley-Baston experiment in Princeton Seminary in 1973. And they had 45 seminarians, which they were assuming there were people that were more inclined to help in a situation. So they set up this experiment without telling the students. They had someone who was disheveled, was lying in their path to the next activity, coughing and going in and out of consciousness. And he told 45 of the seminarians, and half of whom were to go and give a talk on the Good Samaritan. The other half were something general about ministry. But he told a third of them, oh, you're late, you better hurry and you get there. And they told another third, you've got a bit of time, but don't hang around. And you've got a third of them, you've got plenty of time. So the seminarians would leave. How many of them do you think stopped to help this person? 40% stopped to help. 65% of them were not in a hurry. 45% were in a medium hurry, and 10% were the ones in a hurry. Does that say doing the right thing? Does that say ethics about having the time to do the right thing? It's a bit troubling. And do you think those who were about to preach on the Good Samaritan were more or less likely to help? Didn't make a difference. Which is hugely disappointing to me because it means I'm wasting my time here right now. We seem to value stories, but do they help us live better lives, change our behavior? What will the children remember from the story for all ages? Anything? Oh, the man was not wearing underwear. At least they'll remember something. When you leave home, wear clean underwear. What will you remember from this sermon? Because we say stories are important, and I honestly believe stories are important. And a colleague of mine once said, well, as a minister, all the difference you can make is take a bowl of water, put your hand in, and take it out, and that's the only difference you make. And I said to them, if I believed that to be true, I wouldn't be in the ministry. We all can make much more difference than I think we can possibly imagine. So I think stories do make a difference. I think we are hardwired to remember stories. I think they can, over time, shift, because I still remember the Good Samaritan story, and I want to tell you a story from my own personal life that I think it's a Good Samaritan story with a twist. many of you know I worked for a computer company in Silicon Valley for many years. And I was leaving my office to go for lunch one day and was with a group of friends. I was passing a conference room and I looked in and there was 4 or 5 people around having a conversation and there was a person sleeping at the conference table. Shows you how exciting my workplace was. And so I went in and I asked the people, is he okay? And they said, oh yeah, he's fine. He just fell asleep in the meeting. And I thought, So I looked at him, I looked at the people, and I didn't really know the person. I knew one of the people that I was talking to. And I said, okay. I said, well, I won't wake him up because his boss is not around, so I don't need to worry about it. So I left, and I took about 20 yards towards the cafeteria to a different building. I thought, something's not quite right about that. So I went back, and I tried to wake the person, and they wouldn't wake. They wouldn't wake up. So I asked the people to leave, took him down, raised his feet, loosened lay him on the floor, called the medics, who came really quickly, though it seemed like a lifetime to me. And he was a diabetic. And he had collapsed. The paramedic stabilized him. He was in hospital for a week, and he was okay. But I remember leaving afterwards. I got so self-righteous. How could those people not do anything? That was ridiculous. Could he not see that person was in need? And then I realized I had left that person. Those people who were there didn't really see anything was wrong. I thought something might be wrong. But I still chose maybe to leave. Because why did I leave? Well, it was a little bit awkward going in and saying this. And I could sense the people who were standing there were looking at me like, why are you doing this? Why are you making a fuss? He's sleeping. Let him sleep. But, I realized that I thought something was wrong, and I very nearly left that person. And I think we sometimes get so self-conscious about helping. Like, am I making a big deal of something? Why am I doing that? And one of the themes for this month in Soul Matters is presence. The importance of our presence. And of course, in the pastoral care world, we think being present with someone is enough, just being present to listen. But I want to explore that a little bit more. I think we do need to take action. I don't think when we are present, to know is to be responsible for. We have to take actions. Otherwise, we're just another spectator. I think one of the reasons I was able to take action in that situation was because I was an outsider who came in. I'm pretty sure if I was in that meeting, I would have probably left like everyone else. So, and Malcolm Gladwell in The Tipping Point, the book The Tipping Point talks about this, how it's easier for an outsider to take action in a situation than all those present. It's called the bystander effect. People who are observing just go with the consensus, where an outsider coming in and seeing something's wrong will take action. And of course, the reasons for not getting involved are varied. There's embarrassment, there's anger. There's also the idea that once you get involved, there's a sacrifice. You have to take responsibility for that person, and it may go well beyond what you were hoping for. And the Samaritan, he took him to an inn, paid the person, went away, but said, I will come back. He had to come back and take care of the person. So to get involved is a commitment and a sacrifice that we all need to take on. So who is our neighbour? The parable says, our neighbour is the one who showed mercy. Our neighbour is the one who showed mercy. That was the conclusion of the parable. The Samaritan showed mercy to the traveller. He was the one who showed neighbour. So there's not a geographical location to neighbour. It's the person who cares for that other person. And I think many of us are wondering in this political climate, who are our neighbours? I know post-election I was I think in the video to the congregation, I said, I'm confused, I'm numb, I'm disappointed. I'm confused, like how could other people disagree with me politically by so much? So what would it mean to show mercy in the current political situation? Is it hopelessly naive? I think who our neighbours are those who are most vulnerable. We are called to bear religious witness to the struggles, the suffering, the misuse of power in the time ahead. That's what we're called for our presence, to take action for those who are underserved by our community, who are impacted by the upcoming policies. Because the story, mercy is not the person who's passive. Mercy is the person who is active in taking care for another. And we are all called to do that in the days, weeks, months, and years ahead. And can we create the space for us? Because back to that Princeton story, those who were able to take care of others had the time to do it. Can we nourish ourselves, nourish our compassion, nourish our kindness, nourish our care, and fill them up? Because we're going to need them. Because there's people, some in this room, but many outside of this room, who are very vulnerable over the coming weeks and months to government policy. The choir sang, no one needs to be alone. That is a message that's going to become more and more important in the days, weeks and months ahead, because it could be easy to step over to the other side of the road and ignore the needs of so many. But we cannot do that as people of faith, as people who put love of all people at the center of our religion. We cannot step away. We have to engage, we have to commit ourselves, and we have to sacrifice to those who are going to be vulnerable to the losses, to the disruption, to the separation of families that has happened before. Christian thinker Martin Luther said, this life is not righteousness but growth in righteousness, not healing, not health but healing, not being but becoming, not rest but exercise. We are not yet what we shall be, but we are growing towards it. The process is not yet finished, but it is going on. This is not the end, but it is the road. This is not the end, but what lies ahead is the road. I believe deep down in my heart, we desire to love our neighbours as ourselves. And by when I say neighbours, those who are most vulnerable right now and in the days ahead. We desire to show mercy and kindness to those, just as the Samaritan did. Not turn away, but look towards with empathy and walk towards and take action. And as Jesus instructed the lawyer at the end, I invite us to take the time and go and do likewise.